always used to lay you clean up the messes. Down on my knees, thought I couldn't stand up on my own. Turns out sometimes you're stronger alone.
Hey there, just a quick little FYI. I think we maybe had a slight audio issue for about the first 12 minutes. We worked on it. We found an answer, at least, to the potential problem. So if there are some noises in the first 12 minutes that are a little annoying, they just know that they're going away. And I don't think it kills the efficacy of that initial 12 minutes, so we didn't redo it. But I just wanted to let you know up front, just in case there is something that you find annoying, that it is something that will go away. So just going to let you know that, leave it there, and I hope you enjoy the story.
My name is Daniel. I'm 39 years old. I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I am shunned-ish.
All right, shundish. We will talk about that as we go. So Daniel, how was it that you came to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses in the first place?
Born in very rich spiritual heritage, as they would say. I think fourth generation on my mother's side, third generation on my father's. So pretty much everyone I know in my family, going back to almost the start of Witnesses being in Australia. Yeah,
So
goes back a long way.
Were among the first?
I think so. They always used to talk about it a lot when I was a kid, and they had great pride in it, but I always found it kind of icky the way they carried on about it. So I didn't actually pay much attention, and now I can't find out those stories that they had, but that's just how it is. But I know it goes back a long way. Okay. Old Cole Porter days, and yeah.
And so I know you said you weren't really paying attention, but do you remember any part of, like, was there an origin story at all that you remember any details of? You know, was somebody contacted around a war, or was, you know, something like that?
On my mother's, so my mother's side are very much stereotypical white Australian. They go back to early colonization. I don't know their story of how they were first contacted. My father immigrated from Baghdad in, I think it was 60s or 70s, and I know a bit more about how they were contacted. They were initially Catholic and had some real problems within their church. My grandmother on that side really liked her Bible, but didn't like the fact that Catholics seem to take or leave the Bible with a lot of the doctrine. And then when they migrated, they initially went to Canada and then came across to Australia. And I think they were contacted door to door, and she liked how much they were referencing the Bible. And also it gave them a community. Being an immigrant in a country, it's always nice to get a few contacts in that way. So I think that's how that went. And then they studied, and most of that side of the family converted across. I think I've got one CO, former CO. There's my uncle, and another one that I just actually recently tried to reach out. Well, didn't reach out, but just got his details. He was a district overseer, but he left around 2000, but I don't know his story yet. But yeah, they're all writing, very, very active, all elders. And then on my mother's side, again, all elders. We've got somebody on the writing committee in Australia, in Bethel, quite a few Bethelites. Yeah. So,
wow. So not
busy
just
witnesses.
A deep spiritual heritage, as you said, as far as generationally, but they're very deep in.
Yeah, very involved.
Writing committee at Bethel, COs, DOs, all of that. The family is very active, it sounds like.
Yeah, yep.
All right, Daniel. So then with the rich spiritual heritage that was all around you, how did it affect your worldview? How did it make you see yourself and the world around you?
Yeah, we were always told that we were lucky to be born into the truth, especially close to the time of the end. It made us feel like we're pretty special. Like we knew things that the people around us didn't know. We weren't too isolated from worldly people because our schooling was still public schooling and we could still interact with other kids in the neighbourhood, but there was always just a bit of a distance kept there. Couldn't get too close. But yes, still definitely able to interact. We weren't completely isolated in any way, but definitely has a subconscious sense of superiority built into it, I think. And that was there, even though it was never overt. Yeah,
Can I ask? So there's that sense of superiority, and I understand where that comes from. Certainly echoed by myself and my own experience and others, because you do feel special. You know something nobody else does, and but did you? And I don't know, growing up, if your family was as deep into the organization as it is now with people at Bethel and different things. I was just wondering too, like, was there an additional feeling of being special, even as a kid, maybe even just in the organization or congregation, if you had people around you at the time, and maybe you didn't, who held such positions?
Yeah, so my dad was an elder from a very young age. I think he was an elder in his 20s. So it would have been either around the time I was born or shortly after he would have been an elder. So we were always considered elders' kids within the hall, and we were aware of the responsibility and the expectations on you for being part of that. It was never overt. It was just an unwritten culture, and you were aware of the class system within witnesses, or we were from a very young age. I think also we were aware of the messier side of being a witness from a young age too, because Dad having to constantly be in judicial committees and be away out fixing things and being a policeman for the congregation, you realise that it's not all quite as rosy as I think some people believe it is. But yeah, there was definitely, we felt we had the reputation to uphold as an elders' kid. We were aware that an appointed man had to preside over his family in a fine manner, or however they worded it. So yeah, that was definitely something that we knew and was just part of our childhood growing up.
Did that make you feel superior, or did that just make you feel like, ooh, I can tell that there is this extra pressure here, and I better perform?
More a burden than a superiority thing. It just, at times, it felt like our life probably was more strict than some of the other witnesses. But with that, I think you also learn to look down a little bit on the people that are a bit more on the fringe. Part of that judging nature that you're taught to have, that's how it gets framed. Like if you're on the closer towards the center of the organization is the phrase they used to use. If you're doing that and then you're looking out on the fringe, you're taught to fear and judge those out on the edges. So that was creeping in. I wouldn't say that was innate, but that did grow over time.
That makes sense. I mean, again, there is a hierarchy there within the organization, and you can become aware of it. So you kind of felt special in a way regarding the world around you, like you knew something they didn't, and had something they didn't as far as the world outside of Jehovah's Witnesses, because you had the truth, I guess, and then you felt a little different inside, or a little special, because you had the special responsibility, but with, as an elder's kid, but with it, yeah, there is a kind of there's a judging inside the Kingdom Hall too, as far as when others are on the fringes and you're in the center, for sure.
Yeah, Absolutely. Yeah.
Understood.
That was the experience. I think there's a lot of confusion built into it too as a young kid, because a lot of those rules, they're social rules that aren't spoken out loud because they would sound horrible if anyone said them, but you just have to intuit them in a way. And I had a very literal brain as a kid. I still do somewhat. So figuring out those rules was very confusing time, especially through my primary school years.
Oh, I'm sure. Were there any of those rules in particular that you remember struggling with?
Um, it's not so much specific rules. It's more, my son's diagnosed ASD, and I'm possibly on the spectrum myself. I haven't got an official diagnosis, but along with that very literal thinking, I do remember being slightly confused by people that weren't all in, like not striving for full-time service. Like if you actually believed that any day the end could come and there is a chance you wouldn't get through, why wouldn't you be doing everything? Like, and that it's the logic of that seemed off to me when I saw people that were sort of not 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 burning themselves out for the religion because it seemed so risky not to. And I always remember being confused by that when I would look at other people, not in a necessarily a judgy way. It's just maybe I couldn't put myself in their mindset. And
You had a hard time understanding them.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's sort of, I guess it's kind of a black and white thinking, but I also do think the logic there is still sound. Like if you truly believed, it still does sort of, it's a big risk you're playing to not be all in and not absolutely doing everything you can for the religion.
Well, yeah. I mean, yes, it is all or nothing thinking, very black and white, and maybe in your family. I mean, all or nothing black and white thinking is a hallmark of Jehovah's Witnesses anyway, to a large degree. But that could certainly interesting how you phrased it or framed it as why aren't you burning yourself out for the religion? And it sounds like there's a lot of people in your family who do kind of burn themselves out or at least shine brightly in the religion and put a lot into it. But yeah, you ask a valid question. Isn't it interesting that framing of Jehovah's Witnesses believe the end of the world is imminent, but yet the organizations building video production studios and people like if you really thought that the world was on fire and you had to put it was about to or was I guess about to be on fire, wouldn't you want to save as many people from that house as you could? Would you bother going to the movies? Would you bother working and buying that new house or having kids or any of those things? It kind of shows that really they don't believe what they say, by the way they live their lives. You're right.
Yeah, yeah, and absolutely. And also, as I got older, I realized that confusion was even born out from different perspectives from both of my parents. My father was very much a fundamentalist Jehovah's Witness, I would say, where it was straight down the line, by the book. Still very much cherry picked in his favor, but it was this is how it is. Whereas I think with my mother's side of the family, they would be the more liberal types of witnesses. But because my mother had to submit to my father in the relationship, I sort of think there was always that tension there. One example would be things like education. My mother's side of the family is actually quite pro-education in a lot of ways. But they don't really have the freedom to say it overtly, because if you share that view with the wrong person, it gets seen as a sign of spiritual weakness. My mother would even talk to me while I was at school about the possibility of doing something at university. I did quite well at school, but the confusion would arise because my father was quite anti-intellectual. He would often put down people at university, and say that they get arrogant and full of themselves, and that was his whole view towards anyone who had any sort of education.
While putting them down. They're arrogant while he, uneducated, puts them down.
His
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, his phrase in the ministry was, if they're not honest, hungry, and humble, then you just move on. And I sort of think every time we'd come across a well-versed person at the door, or an atheist that's delved into apologetics that could just shut down his arguments, he would say, well, they're not honest and humble. So and that was sort of, I think, so there was confusion there. There were two messages from home. I suppose I leant more towards my father's view of things because he could back his up with Watchtower articles, and it was closer to what was coming from the top. Well, my mum's more balanced view is sort of something that had to be spoken of more quietly.
Yeah, you can, because your mom was thinking for herself?
To an extent. Yeah, I think so.
At least
my mother
more
died,
so.
Yeah, I haven't been, my mother died when I was quite young, so I haven't been able to have any sort of conversations with her as an adult. And also she had kids at a very young age too, so she would have been a kid herself to a certain extent. So I'm not quite sure where her head was at. I'm sort of just piecing it together with memories of little conversations here and there. But she was definitely a true believer and right in. I just think she wasn't, her views were a bit more malleable she allowed more of her humanity to come through. Yeah. But
yeah, she
I don't
wasn't
think,
by the book, so she had some
yeah,
of her own thoughts and feelings about things.
absolutely.
Which,
Yeah. But,
good for her. You're supposed to.
yeah. I can't honestly say that I would have seen her finding her way out of the religion. In a sense, being malleable like that made it easier to move around criticisms because you didn't have to hold too strongly. Whereas I think the rigid approach of my father, if you did find a way in and break that, the whole thing would fall down. So, yeah, flexible and strong as opposed to brittle.
Yeah. A lot of things that are rigid are rather brittle, and
Yeah.
You're absolutely right there. I think that there's a lot of people who are still in the organization who have made the truth their own by literally taking all of those fundamentals and just kind of picking and choosing what feels good to them, and focusing on those and kind of leaving the rest to Jehovah or whatever, and really making it fit who they are a little bit more, instead of transforming their entire being into exactly what it wants them to be, like your dad seemed to be doing.
Yep, absolutely. And I also think they'd look at things through history. My mum's side of the family, because they've been in so long, they saw the failed predictions. They saw how much change would happen. And their way of coping with that was to hold things a bit more provisionally in their mind and to say, well, this might be subject to change in the future. Whereas I think my father's approach was, we don't talk about the past. We don't address those things in the past. We just move on. Yeah. So two very different approaches within the one household. And as a kid, that was pretty confusing. They never fought over it because it was always Dad's way was what went. But as a kid, you see it, you observe it.
Understood. So normally this is kind of where I ask what childhood was like at home and things like that. I did note that you said that your mom passed at a fairly young age for you. So I don't know. How old were you when that happened? I mean, that must have been a really tough time.
Yeah, not when I say young, not too young. So let's see, I would have been about 15 or 16 when she was diagnosed with cancer, and she died 7 years later. But I sort of feel being a witness keeps you young for a long time, so it still felt like I was very young, even though quite a lot had happened in life.
So what
Yeah.
then? What was life like? And so then we'll get to that as we talk about your teenage years and such.
Yeah.
What was life like at home then, growing up? Obviously, there was some confusion as far as versions of the life that you were going to have inside that doctrine and culture. But like, I don't know, what was the temperature of the room? Was it a happy home? Was it tense? Were you guys having, did you have fun?
I do think it was genuinely happy. I've got two brothers, an older and a younger brother. So there was always somebody to play with at home. Like there was always kids in the house, and both my having a family full of boys who were all similar, well, similar and different. But there was, I'd say it was a pretty happy childhood. I think we didn't struggle too much financially. I think early on my parents did, but one thing, definitely a positive thing about my father, he's a very hard worker, and good provider for the family. I think he was motivated. We'll get into it later. He's done some pretty terrible things, but I do think he's motivated by doing what he sees as good. He wasn't around home a lot, being an elder and working full time. He was also in construction, so he'd be very involved with quick builds and things like that. So we didn't see a huge amount of him, but we always had the sense that he was out there trying to help people. So that was okay. Like we were okay with it because we thought he was doing his best. So our mother's influence was probably bigger in our life as far as being raised. Yeah, we would have yearly holidays out to the coast. Lots of family and cousins. We would always get together. We'd have big anniversary celebrations to make up for the fact that we couldn't have birthdays or anything like that. But a lot of the family would get together and do a big family do, and there'd be 40 or 50 people there, all witnesses, all related.
Did you guys exchange any gifts or anything? I know some people would do that for anniversaries, almost as a make-up Christmas.
Yeah, they did. There was a few weddings in the family that were around the same time, so we'd say it was the anniversary, but it was really for a few couples that at the same time were celebrating an anniversary together, and there were sometimes not. They didn't make a big deal of the gifts, but there was usually just a little nice gesture in there. Something my mother did do towards the end of the years, we didn't do Christmas, but she would give us a little, like a holiday allowance that we knew that we could spend away on holidays. So we'd still have a few little treats and things to look forward to at the end of the year. Didn't feel like we were missing out on Christmas too much when we would, obviously on Christmas Eve, and you'd see all the kids come out with all their new things. That didn't feel like it stung as much because we knew that we could go out and buy a few toys while we're on holidays and things too. I think it was a nice way of softening that blow. Another example of the slightly more liberal approach to the witness worldview.
Yeah, that's definitely unique. But lots of parents did things, maybe even you have a kid who's in school and can't, have their birthday party at school like all the other kids, and maybe has to get pulled out on that day. But maybe mom or dad, took the kid out for ice cream the next day or something, did something just to try to get, I mean, they do care about their kids. They're not, they notice that it's tough on kids.
Yeah, actually, you bring up birthdays. It reminds me. I do remember Mum a few times saying with birthdays that the justifications for not celebrating them aren't really not very strong, but she would just leave it at that and move on. I'm fairly heavily introverted. I don't know that I would have liked all the attention on a birthday anyway. It doesn't, with my own kids, it is a nice thing to do for them, but I don't really feel like I missed out too much with it. I guess it's just what you get used to as well, but that was never something that I felt jealous of.
Honestly, for most Jehovah's Witnesses, birthdays seem to be the hardest thing to celebrate, because a birthday means actually valuing and loving yourself and celebrating yourself. And that's where most of us really struggle, because we were taught not to do that. So it feels like an imposter holiday, and we don't feel comfortable speaking up for what we want or even knowing what we want. And heaven forbid other people appreciate us. That for a lot of people, that's a struggle.
Yeah, no, I definitely get that point of view. I think for myself, it just seems a bit arbitrary.
Mm-hmm.
Like just another trip around the sun.
Fun is usually kind of arbitrary.
Yeah, well, I think there's ways you could still value yourself just on a day-to-day.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, I don't like the kind of obligatory attention and the idea that people are obliged to it because it's your birthday. To me, always just felt a bit hollow. So if people want to do that genuinely, then I think that's great. But I got the sense I'd see a lot of people around birthdays and Christmas just being stressed out of their minds because they feel obliged to go along with the tradition that's there and buying into the whole capitalist side of it. And so I've got a bit of a mixed view of it. I can see both sides.
Oh yeah, well, certainly Jehovah's Witnesses made us focus on the people who had those views.
Yeah, that's true.
And you know, to create that as the narrative. But yeah, I mean, obviously appreciating yourself and others every day is a beautiful thing. But it's nice to have special days to aim for, or whatever. And as long as you're doing it again, just because you truly want to celebrate a person and are excited about them, and you are genuine in the celebration, that can be a beautiful thing. I understand what you're saying. Now, there are a lot of people out there who are like, well, I have to get my kids all these things for Christmas and it's the worst. Well, maybe you also can't say no to your kids and are giving them way too much and trying to do way too much. And maybe you're creating that for yourself. I don't know. Maybe you could scale it back and have a lot more fun. It's the spirit with which you go into anything, right?
That's quite possible. And what you say about the framing that I've been raised with, that could be completely accurate. I might not have viewed it like that before. But yeah, that's sort of my perspective on it.
Well, yeah, of course. And our perspectives are informed by the places we've been and the things we've been taught, right? And our personalities and everything else. So nothing wrong with not wanting to celebrate too, if you don't want to. The beauty is we get to do what we want, and we don't have to do what we don't want anymore, right?
That's right. And my kids get to enjoy it even if it wasn't my world. They seem to love it. So
yeah, but it is cool to see that your mom did. She was reasoning through some things through the time about birthdays and the specious reasoning behind it. So you guys, it sounds like were primarily raised by your mom because your dad was so busy.
Yep. I think that's a fair statement. Gotcha. She led things like family studies at home. She, like I was saying, she's a very active witness. She would regularly get pioneer hours, auxiliary pioneer hours, but she never applied to be a pioneer. I always took that as she's doing it for the right reason, not for the title. And I actually think she might have been.
I was gonna say I like your mom. I like that viewpoint. I think that's what she was doing. She may have been more. I mean, while I don't agree ultimately with the things Jehovah's Witnesses teach, I mean the attitude, the that your mom bring to things was unique.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that she was very liked and well respected within the congregation for that view. Because I think it just shows that you're being genuine. And that's a difficult thing to fake. And it also made the averages of the publisher hours for the congregation look great, because you've got somebody doing 50, 60 hours a month that's not a pioneer. It really shifts that mean up a bit. So that's nice for everyone, I guess.
Looks good when the circuit overseer comes around.
That's right. It might have also just been, the pressure that comes along with the title when you're making that commitment, whereas she would just try her best and regularly get those hours, but then you're not beholden to a commitment that you've made. But especially, she didn't particularly like witnessing either. She was quite introverted. So the fact that she was doing that despite her personality, I think showed that she truly believed it, and definitely a level of integrity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So does that mean then, so what that mean for you kids growing up? Does that mean that were you all out in service a lot too? Were you all pioneering without the title with mom?
Yeah, we all got we were out every weekend at least. We weren't pushed at a young age to get the hours through school holidays or things like that. We definitely had our freedom to play through that. As we got older, again, not actually, there were no strict rules around it, but it was sort of expected with being an elders kid that you'd be going above the 10 hours. Yeah, that was definitely the perspective we had, but very rarely missed a meeting. There's a very old school Australian way of you would show up sick. You would have to physically not be able to get to the meeting to miss a meeting. I think COVID might have shifted that perspective a bit, hopefully, but our experience growing up, if you weren't in hospital or actively had an open wound on your head or something, you should be at the meeting. And that was how they lived and how we were expected to live too.
Makes sense. I live that way too.
Yeah.
So that being the case, what was your experience of the meetings and such? Did you enjoy the meetings at all? Did you have friends there? Did you connect to the message? Did you like to go knock on doors or give talks? What was in it for you? Anything?
No, I'm very much an introverted person too. Knocking on doors, I definitely didn't like, especially as a kid. It didn't give me anxiety as such, but I just really it was just a chore, something that I knew was coming. That's probably something I did feel more jealous of for worldly kids, was having weekends that felt like they just seemed to have so much time, just spare time to fill how they see fit. Meetings were incredibly boring. Every now and then you would get a speaker that would try to entertain the audience a little bit. And I used to find it interesting to see how they were doing that, like what their craft was for speaking, what was interesting, because they really stood out, especially amongst all the background noise of, you learn the doctrine from such, raised in it. The doctrine is not complicated, and you really know most of it by age 10. And then it's just hearing it over and over and over again at the meetings. I found dyslexic, so reading along was always a problem for me, but I did used to draw a lot in the meetings, but I'd be listening, but it just never looked like I was. But I think if I could show that I knew what was being taught, they were okay with me. Well, my mum was okay with me just drawing little snake lines in between the gaps in the words in the watchtower and filling in the margins with my own little drawings in the background. But yeah, the meetings were painfully long and boring. There were a lot of kids in most of the congregations we're involved with. My father sort of got treated as a fixer elder. He'd get sent into congregations that were struggling, and he was an elder pioneer and working full time, so busy. He'd get sent in to try and lift up congregations that were a bit stagnant and try and breathe life into it. He has so much energy. So some of the congregations we moved to, there was a quite a big collection of young guys all around our age, and we got into things like playing football and skateboarding, and there was quite a tight-knit group, and I think that was a pretty good childhood. There are some happy memories out of that. Yeah, it was a pretty good childhood, I'd say, especially those earlier years. High school got a bit more complicated, but yeah.
So did you guys move around a lot because your dad was the fixer elder? Did you all like physically move houses to different territories to help out different congregations?
We didn't move house very much, but they'd send us, we'd get moved around sort of within a half an hour drive of where we lived. So we shifted congregations about 3 or 4 times, not a huge amount, but if we had to be driving an extra half an hour for the meetings because that congregation needed us, that's what happened. We would. So that was positive in a sense, because then if you were living in one place and traveling to a different territory's hall, you didn't have to worry about running into people you knew in the ministry. So there was that silver lining. Yeah, but it was, I'd say by and large, a pretty happy childhood.
I was gonna say you could have made a lot of friends going to the different congregations within, a 30-minute or 30-mile or whatever radius. Like you would have met a lot of different people, and so you could have had. So would you say that you said you met quite a few people? Did you feel like you had friends that you were pretty close to, or did the moving make it hard to stay close to anybody?
I actually think it was more to what we touched on earlier about the class differences within witnesses, in that even within the witnesses, unless you were, actually I can't say I honestly had super close friends that were witnesses. Most of the other kids were normal witnesses, not elders' kids' witnesses. And that always, I think you get treated differently by those kids, understandably, because if anyone's likely to be a narc, it's the elders' kid.
I literally just had that that term,
Yeah.
being a narc, like that was in my head, because
Yeah.
that's what they think of you, that you're going to tell on them if they do something. So they don't
And
want the little narc around.
that's not unfounded either.
Sure.
Like we were expected to. So I sort of get where they were coming on from. So I do think there was just naturally a bit of a distance there. I never quite clicked with the other kids. I did end up getting quite close to my cousin, he moved down from up North Australia, a long way up, and he lived with us for a while. So that was probably the only real close friendship I had. And within the Kingdom Hall, there were definitely, everyone was friendly and we all did things together, but I wouldn't say that they were strong, healthy relationships.
So that being the case at the Kingdom Hall, what about at school? Did you go to regular? Your mom seemed to value education, so did you go to regular public school, or were you homeschooled? Did you have friends if you did go to regular school? Well, or at least school friends or whatever you were allowed to have?
Yep, yep. So we went to public school, and I had a couple of primary school. I probably had a couple of friends that I would spend more time with than other kids, and it was probably based more on proximity because they lived close to where I lived, not necessarily personalities that I clicked with best. It's just convenience. That sort of drifted in high school as kids get older and they find their new groups. High school was probably a bit more of a. I didn't have a tough time in high school. I was able to get along with people, but I wasn't really part of any one group. I could sort of fit in anywhere, but I also, as I was getting older, was realizing that these friendships are futile anyway. So it was me keeping a bit of a distance, I think. Plus, it's not. I couldn't do anything anyway. Like I couldn't do too much with anyone anyway. So there was no point in fostering those relationships in any way.
Why in
Yeah.
why invest in having school friends? Because you can't do anything outside of school together anyway. So you
Yep.
just kind of stay to yourself, or just exchange
Yeah.
pleasantries, basically. Keep it light.
We would. There was. I was always. I'd say they were friends, just very much in the school context, and it was never going to be more than that.
Mm.
And I think that boundary, it just organically grew over time. As those friends constantly hear no, that you can't go along to something, then they just stop asking, and they just think, oh well, this is the nature of the relationship. We can be mates at school, and that's just it. When you look back at them now, a lot of them are still in contact with each other, and you can see they really grew into quite a tight knit little group. But yeah, that was never an option for a witness kid.
Understood. So then, uh, going from these different environments, into your day to day life, how did things progress for you along your witness journey and in these different environments as you went into your teenagerhood? Is there anything that happened early on? Any seminal moments that you want to bring up, or that I haven't asked about? Or I don't know when you got baptized, but that
Yep.
usually happens fairly young too. So, were there things there that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, actually, I think that's probably another example of my mother's slightly more liberal view. She didn't push getting baptized at a particularly young age. I don't think we would have been prevented to if we said we wanted to. But it was definitely, they didn't make a big deal about it. I think it was just expected it was going to happen at some point, so they didn't feel like they needed to rush it. And our lives were lived as baptized kids anyway. So I think, again, it might have been my mum's view of not taking the title too seriously. Like, okay, you can be an unbaptized publisher for 5-7 years. You're still out there witnessing. You're still, like, it's that rejection of labels, I think, that might have informed that. I'm just speculating there, but I think that might have been that. And I actually think it was nice. Yeah, that was healthy. But going into teenage, there's more confusion again. So I just remember school being a very confusing time for me, not really understanding humans. um, I Everything seemed very illogical, and it just seemed like a lot of people were just constantly playing these games that I wasn't really interested in playing, like social games that I wasn't interested in playing. But that sort of started to even out a bit. I'd say I became kind of a bit of a light-hearted, more jokery kind of kid through high school. Then by around so year 10, so around 14, 15, I had an intuition that none of the witness teachings were really making sense to me. I hadn't dissected anything. It was just, just an intuition. And that was, I remember I sat down in year 10 because we're always taught that even if we had something upsetting to share with our parents, that we should do it and just trust that they've been through things and their advice will help. So I shared that thought with my father in year 10. And I'd say he didn't get angry. I do think he was definitely hurt and perhaps a bit blindsided by it because there weren't really any indications on our behalf. But it was just, that's how I felt. So I said, it just doesn't, none of it seems right to me. It doesn't seem real. His advice boiled down to sometimes you do need to fake it till you make it. If you keep going through the motions, as you get older with more maturity, it'll all fit into place. Which, I mean, it's not a satisfying answer, but I didn't really have any choices but to go along. I thought, oh, well, he knows where my head's at least. But later on that same year is when my mum was diagnosed with cancer. And that shifted everything. It was, the environment at home was very much a let's rally around mum, and the congregation rallied around her because she was very well liked. And from my brothers and I, the only thought was let's not make more stress at home. And it was very much our problems can go into the background for a little bit because we're not, like, obviously, like,
sure, yeah, let's rally around mom, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a bit of that pseudoscience view that witnesses have of, that stress can actually make a person with cancer can make it sicker. Like they can make the cancer worse and things like that. I know there's no actual evidence for that, but obviously you don't want to be going through cancer treatment and then also having to deal with difficult teenagers at home. So
yeah, stress isn't good for your body, period. So
that's it. So the idea of addressing any problems we had was going to be shut down. But I don't think it was shut down in any malicious way. I think it was just, this is the situation we're in. We've got a person that's got a terminal illness that obviously is going to take precedence over your own feelings. The idea that any of that, I mean, if I look back on it now, really psychological help would have been good for the whole family in addressing that, but that's not going to happen within the witnesses.
Are you saying that when you're saying that your feelings around that didn't matter, do you mean, were you referencing the feelings about like, hey, I'm not so sure this is all true, and you had to kind of take that ideology and put it in your pocket because I'm not going to make waves questioning everything that we believed? Or are you saying like, I'm watching my mom die and this is horrible and I'm a kid, I don't have the tools to handle this, and that your feelings there were dismissed?
It's both. So for the former, it became very obvious to me that I'm not going to get to age 18 and leave the witnesses because it could, in my mind at the time, it could quite literally harm my mother, like in a very physical way. So that was, it was just never an option.
I understand that, yeah.
It wasn't even something I struggled with. It was just, no, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to treat people in my life like that. And worst case, I wasn't unhappy. Like, I didn't have a sad childhood. So I'll just go along with it, and I'll try to fake it till you make it, and just accept my circumstances for what they are, and this will be my life now. So it was very much put aside and put in my pocket. But I don't feel any ill will towards that. I think it was just the way that things played out. I don't think there was any malice from anyone. It's just the circumstances we found ourselves in. As far as dealing with illness,
But that's
I'm
tough
not
as a kid
Yeah.
to watch your mom go through that and to be, without any kind of help or support.
It was very complicated. Again, too, the congregation really rallied around it. We had people on meal rosters, and everyone was lovely. And so she was only, I think, 38 when she was diagnosed. So for somebody that was fairly well known and well liked, it was the tragedy of the situation, I think, got a lot of attention. So I think there was a lot of sympathy, genuine sympathy and empathy from witnesses, and they did a lot. They really did do a lot to try and help our family. Like 3 teenage boys at home, and mum going through chemo on and off, and there was just so much happening. And seeing that from the congregation actually reinforced the idea that maybe this is a good group of people that I should be staying with. Maybe they're onto something. Like, even if it doesn't feel right to me, like, I've got a real world example of nice people coming together and helping.
Mm-hmm.
So that played into the confusion of the logic of it, or the feeling of it not being true, but then actually seeing the works of it and having a real tangible example of it working. All the positive things that they preach about in our situation, we saw a lot of them. I think in that sense, quite often people will experience a terminal illness in a family and it will drive them further away from their religion. I think for us, or for me personally, it solidified it and made it something that I thought I would pursue. And from that point on, so I had the 2 years going through high school from year 10 to year 12, where everything was just sort of numb and put aside. But then by the time I graduated, I'm going all in on the whipses. This was just what life was going to be now. And we'll do our best. Shortly after school is when I got baptized. So it was around 18, 19.
What made you do that? What pushed you to actually take that, take the formal step?
That was bringing some sort of happiness to my mother. There was an opportunity. For me, it didn't feel like a big spiritual gesture. It felt like it's a simple thing I can do that I'm probably going to do at some point anyway, and it can bring a bit of happiness, so I might as well do it. It didn't have the gravity of a personal decision for myself. It didn't seem like a big spiritual step for me. It just felt like the right thing to do. But it was more of a right in the sense of the relationships in my life, not right as in a spiritually right thing to do. So just more a gesture than anything else. The fact, when I look back on it, I know I didn't take it that seriously because I baptized at a circuit assembly in the morning and missed out on the afternoon session because we were going to the snow with some friends. So I didn't even sit through the whole session that I was baptized in.
Wait a minute. You got baptized and then went to the slopes to ski or snowboard or something for the second half?
Yep. So, you got your morning session and then your baptism just before lunch, typically, at the circuit assemblies.
Oh, that is the coolest baptism story I've ever heard.
And
Oh,
it didn't stand out to me as odd at the time, but I also think we were given more leeway because of the tragic situation we're in. Like, I don't think anyone was going to push too hard to say not do it. Everyone was just like, look, they're going through a lot. You're getting baptized, so that's a good thing. There's no point in pushing. And yeah, that flexibility was there. I don't think that would be there for a lot of people that couldn't pull the cancer mum card out of their pocket and play it.
I mean, yeah, I've never heard of that. I can't imagine anybody going and getting baptized and then bailing on the rest after they get baptized. That's yeah, that's a really interesting thing. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, I think when I reflect on it, it just sort of shows where my head was at. In
Yeah,
that
it does.
this is just something to do that will help, but it's not a grand gesture in any way. It's not. I'm not taking a big spiritual step here. I did also think that my perspective might have been that, well, I'm still going to be a witness. This isn't a sign of weakness in any way. We're still all in. This is just how we're approaching it. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I'm thinking about like your mom seemed to be one who wasn't for titles and wasn't necessarily performing to be seen. She
Yep.
did the things that she was a very bottom line kind of person. And it sounds like that's kind of what you were doing. You were just bottom lining it. I got baptized. I did the thing. Um, I'm not gonna not be one of Jehovah's Witnesses anymore right after baptism because I went to the slopes out in the snow. So yeah, let's just go, and then I'll come back and be a witness again.
Yeah. Yeah. Overall,
Wow.
life wasn't going to change a huge amount. Like how
No.
I lived was going to change a huge amount. So, yeah, in that sense, I probably didn't take it as seriously as a lot of people do. But I also think you're right. It's probably because of mum's influence and her perspective on things that it shouldn't be made a big deal of, because what matters is what you're actually doing. Yeah.
Did your mom have problems missing meetings? Like, did she ever miss meetings? And like, because I know you talked about going even if you were sick. I was just
Well,
wondering, like, and I don't mean with her cancer. I just mean like, was she a person at times that was like, "Hey, I can take a meeting off,"
no.
because I mean, it's not like it changes anything, or that was at least she was drawing the lines just in different places.
Yeah, drawing the lines in different places. She would always be at meetings, and to an extent, she always had to be, because Dad was always doing something judicial or something. Quite often, if you're being the fixer elder, there's a lot of problems going on in congregations. So when we moved around the teenage years to the hall we were in, most meetings would be a judicial meeting afterwards that could go anywhere from an hour to 2 hours after the meeting. So we're sitting in the hall with nobody there. So Mum would have to be there, just as a way of supporting Dad and everything he was doing. But no, definitely until her cancer got really bad, even through most of the treatment, she was at meetings. So yeah, that was very much something that's more a cultural thing, I think, with the old school Australian culture. It's you just go. You don't make a fuss. You just go.
Well, I mean, that itself is kind of a fundamentalist type of, this is the thing that you do. It's your responsibility. That's how my family was too, in America. It was just, I mean, my dad had kidney disease and uh, diabetes, and he couldn't even feel his feet because of the neuropathy a lot of times. And yet there he was out in service, knocking on people's doors, falling off their porches and their steps into bushes because he couldn't feel his feet, but he had to be out there because that's what you do, right? Or I think he fell off a stage at the Kingdom Hall once because he couldn't give a talk because he, couldn't get around real well. But you do what you do. I mean, that's what Jehovah's Witnesses do. Again, it's a very performative cult. So they
it gives them a sense of pride too, I guess, to say, look, I can push through this and still do what I need to do. It's a way of signaling how serious you take your religion.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. It's a sign of your spirituality, right? I
absolutely.
go
Yeah.
even when I'm sick.
Yep. Even I'm going to make other people sick.
Yes, I go even when I'm contagious,
Yep.
which is why they had to
Yeah.
shut things down around COVID because they know they would have spread it all over. Everybody would have shown up.
Absolutely. It would have been an interesting thing to experience from within inside the religion, I think, to see the conflict that people have. But anyway, yeah, so that gets me through to about age 19 or so. Um, Around that time, I started dating my wife too while we were out on a witnessing trip, a rural witnessing trip together. So that's age 19. I'm an apprentice electrician at the time, working with. I was always going to be in construction. My father was in construction. We're always sort of, that was our path. My brothers were all getting into construction, working only with other witnesses. The guy who took me on as an apprentice he's a really nice guy. I can't speak highly enough of him. And that was a nice transition to the world of construction, because construction can be a bit of a rough industry to be in, but he was not that person. He wasn't your typical rough tradie. He was quite a soft-spoken, intelligent, nice person, and so that was I was lucky to fall into that apprenticeship. So I was dating through that apprenticeship. Got married at age 22, I think I was 21, 22. So it was a bit of a difficult time because mum was quite sick around that time too. So that was, I don't think my father was too happy about me being in a relationship so young. I think from his perspective, it was just, there's going to be a lot happening at home. Mum's getting sicker. So I can sort of, he never said that. His line was always, "You're not past the bloom of youth."
When would that be?
That's right. One of the discussions I had with him, I said, "Well, how do you know somebody is? What specifically is a person doing?" Because they throw that line out, but they don't tend to dig any deeper into it. And I was young. Even as a 19-year-old, I think I was a young 19 because I'd only ever lived at home, and you're a witness. You don't get to grow up at the same rate as everyone else.
But don't people? I mean, I don't know what the culture is like in Australia, but at least around here, it's not. I mean, most people get married uh, probably before 22. While I think that it's not a great age necessarily to be getting married at myself, you don't even know who you are. Um, as Jehovah's Witnesses, though, was it abnormal that you guys were getting married at that age, or did
Not at
he
all.
just not like it himself?
He didn't like it. He somewhat didn't have a leg to stand on though, because he got married younger than I did. And what does it say about your relationship? Like, they seem to have a good relationship. So any warning things that they were going to try and give, that's sort of like, well, look at you guys, it worked for you. So yeah, I can't get inside his head. I don't know why he didn't want to. It might have just been the fact that it was possibly going to be stress at home. Yeah, I'm not sure. But that was on and off again. But my wife and I got on really well and we clicked. So yeah, we ended up getting married. And yeah, then it got quite eventful. So we were married in October. Around April of the following year, Mum died. So it was around the time of the memorial, which is a tough start to a marriage. My wife and I were actually still living at our family home in a granny flat out the back at the time. So everything was all still, I think that's tough on my wife being around. Like, it's very much in my family unit.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no separation there. There's no chance for us to be our own selves. And then 6 months after that, my cousin, who I was quite close to when I was younger, committed suicide. And that was, I mean, you're still in the stages of being numb, and then another thing happens that hits just as hard. So all that's happening. Let's see, I'll just check what I had. This is all 2006.
Can I ask, was that cousin, were they witnesses as well?
Yeah, so I won't go a huge amount into their story. We were very close, sort of my early teenage years. We'd be together constantly. We were really close mates. As I grew older and started to take the religion more seriously, he was a year younger than me. It wasn't clicking for him. And he was sort of drifting on his way out. So as I was doubling down, he was drifting out, and that drew us apart from each other a bit. So that's a pretty big regret, in that he probably lost his closest mate going into the religion, and he felt he couldn't walk that path. He had his own traumas. I think he was struggling with some things from his past. And it just got worse and worse for him. He was just such a genuinely nice and authentic kid. I think he was too nice for the religion. Like, too genuine, too authentic, too much.
He had feelings, and they probably got hurt a lot by the toxicity of the emotional abuse that exists within the religion.
Yeah, and just, I think if you're a very caring person, it's harder to stick with the religion. Whereas if you can be a bit more detached, you can go further in the religion. Like,
that's not a good sales pitch for the religion.
No, but I mean, you look at how it's.
But you're right. Yeah,
people that make it. It's
you have to be cold and detached for your greatest hope in life to be the death of 8 billion people, so that you can be happy on a paradise earth.
Absolutely. So,
wow,
I think that was his struggle. Yeah.
I mean, that would have been a tough time for you. I mean, how were you coping? You talked about being kind of numb. Was there any aftercare? So, I mean, your mom passes. I know they have the memorial service and such, and people bringing food is nice, but like, did anybody talk to you? Did people rally around you at all, or offer you any kind of, a soft place to land, somebody to talk to, a listening ear, encouraging some counseling of some sort, or anything? Allow me to break in here for a second. This channel is made possible by you, the listener. If you appreciate what we're doing here, please consider supporting at patreon.com/shunned, or leave a review on iTunes or other platforms. Like and subscribe. All those things help the channel. If you're looking for merch, you can go get some Shun swag from the shunnedpodcast.com website, or reach out there to be on the show. If you're looking for more ex-Jehovah's Witness content, I'll recommend my first podcast called This JW Life. You can find that on podcast apps as well as YouTube. And if you're feeling stuck in life, struggling to find happiness and community, maybe you're haunted by the past, beating yourself up, unsure of who you are or what you even want out of life now that you've lost this one identity that was given to you by a cult, reach out through my other sites like exjwhelp.com, that's exjwhelp.com, or storyworkscoaching.com. And let's see about working together to help you find a life that fits you and who you are, maybe for the first time ever. And now, back to our guest.
To an extent, I think a lot of people felt really sorry for us. Like, it had been a long time coming. So she was going in and out of remission for 7 years, and the last couple of years were pretty hard on her. So it's not like it came as a surprise. The funeral was huge. I think there was 400 people there. It was spilling out of the hall and into the car park. I don't know that witnesses really have comfort to offer, that people just don't, you know everything they're going to say. They don't have anything new that you haven't been taught your whole life. So hearing it again in that situation, the funeral felt more like it was for other people. Like,
well, it is. It's not usually very
a lot of funerals are, though. Like, I don't think that was unique. I think it might be that same attitude again of being a bit contrary to seeing it, but it felt very hollow. It didn't feel like it's what I needed, but it wasn't about me. It seemed like it was about what everyone else's sorrow and feeling like they needed to say their piece. And to an extent, they're dealing with a certain level of grief too. Mine didn't supersede that. I was closer, so it probably should have taken some precedent, but that's not to take away from other people's feelings in any way.
Well, sure, but I mean, I've been to funerals that are non-Jehovah's Witness, and it's all about the person who was lost and the support for the people who are left behind, and making them feel comforted and rally around those people, maybe even having like a receiving line of sorts, like where people are like coming through and everybody is talking to the family and sending their condolences and giving them hugs and things like that. Jehovah's Witnesses funerals don't know how they do it in Australia, but at least here don't usually have any of that kind of stuff.
No, looking back, funerals are weaponized. They spoke a lot about Mum and how faithful a person she was, but then they always pivot into, we get to see her again. Make sure you are there to see her again. It's weaponized. It gets used to, well, now you've got to double down. She fought the fight to the end. She did the right thing. She's in the safest place, whatever line that they use. But then the idea of it's not support, it's used as a rallying cry or a kind of sick motivation for you to double down as a witness.
Absolutely. And there's also, again, I think you alluded to it, I asked the question, was there any real help? Did anybody help you talk about your grief? Did they ask you, was there any continued support? Was there counseling of any sort where you could talk about your loss? I mean, yes, it's not like it was a surprise, but it was also the end of a 7-year slog. I mean, that's a long path, a long, painful journey to take in its own way. And so while it's maybe not an immediate burst of unexpected grief, there's still grief there that to be addressed.
Yeah. I think people in general aren't very well equipped in how to offer that kind of support. I don't know that I'm great at it either, even though I've been through it. And it wasn't forthcoming, but I don't think it was withheld either. I think people...
They just don't have it.
Yeah, well, we had people around us and they would have been happy to talk about it, but my memory of the time is I didn't have clear thoughts about it myself, so I couldn't really express what's happening to anyone else in any meaningful way. I don't think that they actually have the support to give. I don't think they would know how. So
there's not a lot of emotional intelligence there usually.
that's it. And so I didn't really felt like I was left out alone in that scenario. I just sort of, again, it was just an accepting of the situation being what it is. And by and large, I think from the witnesses, we got a lot of sympathy and care and attention, but no real. Yeah, I don't think they have it to give. I don't think they have the psychological support to give because I don't think they have it for themselves. So, yeah, looking back, I don't hold that against anyone that was in it. It was just a tough situation. We did have a lot of family around, so that was nice. They were there. It got more complicated in that the last few months, possibly a year of Mum's life, my father had started an emotional relationship with another person before she had died. And that wasn't official. It's just, so my father was spending a lot of time pioneering and another pioneer sister, and they grew close while Mum was dying. And I think, which I get it, I realise how that sounds. We, as in my brothers and I, weren't necessarily aware of that going on. But we came to find out later on that a lot of people in the congregation were really uncomfortable with it. They saw the sort of amount of time being spent together and flirting, things like that. And I do think that my brothers and I, it made us uncomfortable, but we didn't have clear thoughts as to why, because we just didn't have clear thoughts about anything at that stage.
Sure.
But it definitely made things after Mum died very complicated because very shortly after they were officially dating, by the next year they were married.
And honestly, that happens. Like I've known a lot of stories of that. I'm sure if people dropped it in the comments, they know of lots of stories like that. There's just lots of people in the organization. I don't know why I want to say brothers in particular. Perhaps perhaps that's just bias based on the stories I know, but who move on very quickly after the loss of someone that they loved.
Yeah, and
don't even know how to be single for any time and need to marry.
Yeah, and sorry, frog in my throat.
Oh, sorry.
It seemed at the time, I don't know, it was a tough time for my father too. Like he'd been taking care of something.
I'm sure
he was dying for a long time. So
yeah,
but the fact is, it came across as you're choosing a new relationship. I think my brothers and I saw this as an opportunity for us to grow together through this trauma and become a tighter unit, because we weren't before. Mum was the one at home. But it was like, well, you're choosing somebody else at this very critical time. And I think that it kind of severed a relationship there was an opportunity. That was a crossroads, I think, where we could have been closer or it could have driven us apart. And I think it sort of definitely set up some walls that just weren't going to come down easily. And he's doing what he needed to survive, but I sort of think that leaves us as collateral in the meantime. So that whole time was pretty tricky.
Yeah, certainly could have been handled better.
Yeah.
At a minimum.
Just kept ringing in my head that I should be waiting to start a relationship. All that advice I was getting about waiting to start a relationship. And so I think your wife has just died. If anyone should be waiting. But anyway, again, I don't think my father was in his right mind. He can't have been. He was dealing with his own grief. I do think the woman that he was seeing it's a bit predatory on her behalf to come in that situation because she's not dealing with the grief. But yeah, that was how that all unfolded, and it made it. It's just another thing to add onto that year after. So I was married. My mother died. My cousin died. Dad gets remarried. It's all a lot happening. Yeah, and during that whole thing, I wasn't coping with grief. I had a very set idea of how grief would unfold. Like, because I'd had a long time to get used to the idea of what's happening, I had in my mind, yeah, this is going to feel a certain way, and then over time it will feel this way, and then you'll move through it. And just a naive way of thinking about how things would happen. And then it doesn't play out like that at all. And I think it turned me into not a very nice person to be around. I think I was a difficult person for my wife. But yeah, a lot of that part of my life is the memory of it is a bit patchy. And I think that might just be a trauma response.
Yeah, because you were grieving.
Yeah, absolutely. And not, yeah, it's a foundational shift and then having to rebuild, but then not really having any skill at doing so, not having any solid models in my life anymore to follow. Yeah, and I think, unfortunately, my wife bore the brunt of where my head was at.
Sure.
Yeah, so I was just a detached person. We moved out of our home and moved up the coast, up north, for a couple of years to try and set out on our own path. And then my wife was pioneering that whole time, and I was sort of auxiliary pioneering on and off, just working to earn just enough to do pioneering. And that was those few years of my life. They were not fun at all.
Do you think did you get busier maybe in service in the congregation, just even as a way of coping, to keep your mind occupied, to stay busy, things like that? Was that part of your process?
Yeah, so I was a ministerial servant by that stage, so I was already pretty busy. I was always on the path to becoming an elder, I think. It was just, that was how it was going to unfold. And I think it would have been an easy path for us to take because of all the connections we had within the religion. And it was more being on autopilot. I don't think we upped our activity in any way, but it was just being on autopilot and just doing what we had always done. It was odd to me. I mean, it makes sense when I look back, but it was odd to me because she died around the time of the memorial. Every time another memorial would roll around, all the same things are happening in your life. And obviously that's reopening a wound. And I found it very difficult to be going to memorials. And that was a real conflict because that's the most important meeting you've always got to get to. But for me, that had so many hooks in it linked to grief. And I remember being confused by my own internal conflict about that. And it started to feel like, well, maybe I don't truly believe, like, if this is my response, there's something wrong with me.
I have a normal human response to grief. There's something wrong with me.
That's it. I mean, you look back on it now and it's clear as day what's happening, but in the time, all it is confusion and uncertainty.
Sure.
So that did settle down over time. I mean, with time, things get less raw. we moved back down to, it was actually the congregation where my mother grew up, where my grandparents still were. So we've been married a couple of years. I couldn't find any work up on the little holiday town where we were living, so I moved back down and I started working actually with my father. He worked for a brother that owns a high-rise set of units right in the city. And we did all the maintenance, and I went through and did all their electrical work and their pay TV and access control, and it was a big contract, so I was there full-time, and that was good, stable work. It did mean that I was constantly around my father. And there was no animosity there, like overtly. I think my brothers and I had just kind of buried the discomfort that was around how everything unfolded, which is a pattern I'm starting to see.
I say, if you bury it, it's still there, though.
It's still there, but I think that it felt like there was an obligation to just move along. It's sort of the expectation that we had of our own grief that, well, you should be moving along, so move along. Yeah, and so we were working there for quite a while, and then my son was born in 2010. So I was there for a couple of years. First son was born. I'll just check. I just had a look at my timeline.
Oh, yeah, no worries.
Yeah, so my son is born in 2010. I'm just working full-time. My wife's was pioneering quite a bit up until the time that my son was born. We were fairly active within that congregation. And then after my son was around 2 or 3, I started teaching him out of the Bible stories book, the way I'd been taught. And there was no one set moment for me, but this is probably as close as a set moment to the beginning of a deconstruction, was the Bible stories book, story of Abraham and Isaac. And it just was not sitting right. And then a lot of those previous things that I had ignored for a long time, I think it was okay for me to ignore them for myself because I knew that this is only affecting me. But now that I have to teach somebody else, I needed to be more sure of what I was teaching. It's sort of like I knew the level of cognitive dissonance I could live with. But it was different once I had to imprint these ideas on another person. So
Well,
I thought,
sure, yeah, it makes you look at it anew. It's like when someone learns a foreign language, a second language, and starts to get into the witness's material in that second language, they're having to say things and think about what they're saying while they're saying them, and it hits differently when it's not automatic anymore. And for you, you were starting to think about these things you're teaching your son, like Abraham and Isaac, not the best story, is it?
No, and it's presented as a moral story.
Yes.
And the moral is horrible.
Yeah. Did you want to take your son out with a knife and go up to a big hill and see what happened?
And you're realizing that what you're imprinting is the idea that the religion will come ahead of the relationships. And I had just lived through that, where like that'd been my whole life, and it wasn't something that was a nice thing to live through. And here I am laying the groundwork to accept all that all over again for another generation. But in the back of my mind, I assumed that if I dug deeper into this, there would be solid reasons that could explain how this was meant to work. I had always assumed I had people that I considered very intelligent and studious in my family. I thought, they've figured this stuff out. I'm willing to take their word for it. But at this point, I wanted to know what those deeper reasons were. So then I thought, it just made me revisit things that I had been doubting in the past that I just never addressed. And the big thing for me, it was probably because it was new at the time, the Origin of Life brochure had come out. Do you remember they released, there were two brochures that came out around the same time dealing with evolution and creation.
Was that like maybe, because I left in 2015?
Yes, it probably would have been a few years before that.
Oh, well, I had already been inactive and not going to the meetings a lot. So maybe I missed that brochure. I mean, I remember the creation book, Life, How Did It Get Here, by Evolution and by Creation. But those brochures I just saw as like, it's probably a regurgitation of the same stuff. So I really don't care.
Where the Origin of Life was focusing more on abiogenesis as opposed to like they really wanted to go in on that specific topic.
Interesting.
And what was interesting about that brochure is it's, to my knowledge, the only time they've ever put all their citations in the back, which is unheard of for JW literature. And I had always had an affinity with science, and I liked science, but I could never understand why all these intelligent science people believed in evolution, because it was obviously false with everything that we'd been taught about it. And I thought, I'm just going to read through this brochure, which I thought was very well reasoned, and I'll look up the citations and understand it even deeper. So if I run into one of these arrogant uni students at the doors that thinks they know more about biology than I do, I'll be able to pick them apart with all these citations. And the problem with that was, I'd say at least half of the citations were completely out of context. Like some were just, I'd say, half-truths, and others were completely misrepresenting what has been said in the article. And that blew my mind and was very destabilizing. And at the time, I was naively sharing what I was finding with my father, because I thought, surely you'd want to know. Like, this is...
It was just about truth here, right?
That's it.
Yeah.
Like, I thought, I must be missing something here, or maybe I'm seeing this the wrong way. So I just dug in further and further. So I'd started the deconstruction, and I became a bit obsessive about it. I think it opened a Pandora's box of, well, what else is half-truths, or are there lies here, or what other things have I taken as true and well-researched that weren't? And it got me to the point where I would be waking up, and it'd affect my sleep, because I had so many questions in my head that I just had to obsessively pick apart. So I'd be going into work at 3 a.m, so I could do a few hours of research before my workday started. And I broke down a folder with all the reasons why I believed what I believe. I think I had about 7 different reasons that I had just always thought, well, this is what the foundation of my belief is, things like prophecy. And I thought, I'm going to systematically break down each one. And instead of just using the Watchtower Library CD, which is all I had at the time, I'm going to look for the best possible arguments for and against on both sides. Because the thing those citations in that brochure had showed me is that the depth and the nuance is all on the outside of the witnesses. like the witnesses have a response and possibly one retort, but that's where it stops. And if you dig further than that, then you're just showing a lack of faith. So yeah, I started breaking that down. I was sharing what I was finding, which wasn't smart, but I had a fire in my belly about it, because I was like, the feeling of being very betrayed, but also feeling like people would want to know this. Surely you'd want to know if you're being lied to.
Yeah, we were taught to find truth and share it with people. So it's amazing, when you naively find new truth and start sharing it with them, and then they don't want any part of it.
Yeah, and not only do they not want a part, it's they aggressively don't want a part. They really don't want to know.
Yes, they aggressively deny what is being said. Yes.
Yeah, and which again I found confusing. I look back on it now as being naive, but that's that literal mind that I've always had, where it's like this isn't it's either right or it's wrong. And wouldn't you want to be on the right side no matter what the right side is? And simple fact is, I don't think most people do. And I don't even think that's unique to witnesses. I think people will quite often choose comfort or familiarity over hard truths.
Mm-hmm. People want to hear what makes them feel good or what goes along with their preconceived notions.
That's right. I just think witnesses have got a much more involved system to buttress that comfort, because it's
they've had 100-something years to gaslight people. They've done a marvelous job of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think, looking back on it, I don't think I was a particularly nice person at that time either. Like, I was waking up from being a witness, but I was also devoting so much time and attention to pulling apart these questions that I was fairly neglectful of other people in my life. Like, I think it just would have been tough, because that's all I was doing. Like, that's where all my attention and all my energy was, and I wasn't really in a position where I should have been giving that much attention to that, but it was.
Well, how can you not, when the foundation and the thing that is supposed to be the focus of your life, you are now finding out is not what it purports to be? I mean, I think it's just kind of a natural outcropping of, I mean, the witnesses had dominated your life your whole life, right? That had been your focus, and it was every relationship. It was everyone around you. It was everything inside of you. So I think it's typical, at least, that everything else probably is going to get neglected because you are going down that path or that road. How could you not? If you're deeply attached to it at all, how could you not? There's some people who can just walk away because they were never that attached to the thing anyway. But for a lot of us, and those of us with logical minds, we want to go through and disprove it all, or prove it all, or see what other sources say. So I think that's a fairly normal path.
Yeah, and I do agree with that. I just think the extent to which I was laser focused on it, I think it just showed a lot of my emotional immaturity at the time, in that that became the most important thing in my life. Like, figuring all that out, and really, there's more to life than if I look back and had my time over, I think I just would have been a bit more gentle about the process, because there was no rush. Like, it didn't have to be that intense, that quick. But that's just how I approached it.
You did the best you could at the time with the tools you had.
Yeah, and on the flip side, the amount of information I got through was incredible. It felt like I had shut down my curiosity for the first 3 decades of my life, and now I didn't have to anymore. Everything was on the table. And once I realized that dishonesty was definitely part of the witness religion and part of their publications and all the things that I thought were well reasoned, I didn't know how to know what was true anymore, because that presupposition was just given to me. It's the truth. You're surrounded by smart, loving people who believe it, who surely have done their own research, and they've come to that conclusion that it's true. Once that foundation's gone, I physically typed into Google, how do I know what is true? And that sort of led me into epistemology and philosophy, and I realized people have been asking these questions for a very long time. I thought, okay, well, I approached it the same way as I did in my folder. I said, there's competing ideas about how people say what's true. I'll just look at the strongest ones and see what I think makes sense. And I found a whole lot of online university courses that I could download and listen to while I worked, which was great. So I took courses in critical thinking, formal logic, biology. And once I had those, I thought, I can't argue against it. Critical thinking, it breaks things down into almost an algorithmic approach to a question. And that really appealed to me. It intuitively, I think that's just how my brain worked anyway. So it felt like a natural fit. And it also it gives you a bullshit detector. I think it's a Carl Sagan term, where people are going to try and convince you of things. You can have a very simple toolbox to break down the substance of their arguments and when they're being dishonest with their reasoning and how they're being dishonest with their reasoning. And then when I applied it to JW literature, it's just so clear to see that it's just emotional manipulation and poor reasoning. And during this process, I'm sharing, silly, I'm sharing what I'm finding, and it's just straining all the relationships in my life. And I'm becoming almost aggressively opposed to the lies. Like I want to break it all down and show people. I almost got a level of arrogance where I felt like I could go toe to toe with any witness and just dissect every single thing they believe in front of them, thinking that that would change their minds. Whereas all it did was make me look like an angry apostate.
Well, you were going to look like that no matter what, but
yeah,
just because you disagree, but I understand it. Well, I mean, Jehovah's Witnesses love to talk about and point to the quote bitter apostate, and there are a lot of people who, even in the ex-Jehovah's Witness community, like to point out the bitterness in others and to kind of demonize that. But you know what? When you've been lied to for 3 decades of your life, you have every right to be bitter for a little bit. It may not be where you want to stay, but certainly if you care about yourself at all, you're probably going to pass through bitter land somewhere on the journey toward healing, because nobody wants to be pranked for 30 years. That's a long con, And so when you're going to feel some of those feelings, again, that's just a natural byproduct of it. But when you start sharing that stuff with others, and I was guilty of that, I had a hard time keeping my mouth shut too. It doesn't make you any friends.
No.
Not at all, does it?
And I don't think I was a particularly nice person to be around, even if I was technically correct on everything I was saying.
Because again,
There's
no emotional intelligence yet.
no emotional intelligence. I don't think I was a nice person. I wasn't easy to be around, I don't think. So I get their perspective, and I actually think it's quite a clever move that JW's used, that you're going to find these angry people when they leave, but they're just angry not for the reasons that witnesses think they're angry. They're angry for perfectly justified reasons. But it does feel like you're playing into their hand a bit by getting emotional. But that's just how it unfolds.
If you're a human, you should be emotional about it. But because they devalue emotion and see emotion as weakness, then they, even though they're exploiting it the entire time. Again, it's just anyone listening, go watch the movie Gaslight and tell me that's not what Jehovah's Witnesses are doing. They're trying to make you seem like you're the crazy emotional one because you're pointing out with emotion how everything they say is wrong, or that they're doing something and tricking people. And so it's just that. Can I ask, I know you're telling your dad, you said you were telling the people around you, so I'm guessing you may have been telling your wife.
I was upfront that I said there's some things here that aren't fitting, and I'm going to dig into it because I didn't think it was wrong. And if anything, I wanted to prove it true to a depth where I felt comfortable to teach my son. Mm-hmm. That was the intent going in. Mm-hmm. It did shift, obviously, when the process backfired. And I mean, it's a tough call to make because I think it's a hurtful decision to tell somebody that you're going to go down that path of research when it could jeopardize a relationship. Because quite often, and most of the times, you will see one person leave the witnesses and it ruins the relationship. Like, it's a very real possibility. And if anything, it's quite likely to happen. So,
it's tough, isn't it? I had to do it too.
And I should have handled, again, it's an example of where I think I went in too aggressively and probably bulldozed my way through. It's a regret. It's something I would handle different if I had my time over. But I was open, not with all the detail. I was always, if there's anything that I've researched that she wants to know, I'd share it. But I wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything within my own, not actively.
Yeah, there's a false premise, or there's something that underlies the whole thing that's wrong to begin with, and that is that a relationship would be based on two people being in the same cult and thinking, believing, seeing things exactly the same way. That's not a healthy premise for a relationship to begin with. So it's kind of hard when you come to this position. If you care about the person that you're with, of course you're going to want to share with them things that are healthier than the things that you came from, right? And there is no perfect way to do so. It's tough. I know I lashed out about things that I would see after the meeting. We get into the car and I'd be like, well, that was bullshit, and you shouldn't talk about people this way, and that is hateful to everyone around us, and that's not loving even to the brothers and sisters, and I would just point out this stuff because I just couldn't not. Like you said, it was like that fire that burns within, and that's just, you're learning so much at that time. You got to have some forgiveness for the old you, because there's no rule. there's no book that tells you how to go through that.
Yeah, and
it's tough. But I just wanted to see, how was your wife reacting to it? Like, what was the dynamic there? Because you're seeing all these things and sharing them. How hard was it for her? Was she able to take that on, or?
Yeah, I don't want to share too much of her story,
Okay.
because I feel like that's her. I know I was difficult for her to be around, so I know I didn't make things easy. There was as far as the religion goes, though, as soon as I was questioning, I think the red flags went off my father quite early on. He'd been involved with lots of cases of apostasy in the past. And I think he saw where things were headed quite early on. So he was having big conversations. He was getting other elders involved, and we'd have meetings over at our house and long discussions and email chains trying to break things down and going back. This is over the series of years. I was always careful not to have it in a judicial setting, so that they didn't have anything I said couldn't be then weaponized against me. I think one of the advantages of growing up as an elder's kid in a witness house, you know how it has to work on their behalf for them to enforce things. So I was always open to chat to elders, but never in a way that what I was saying could be used to kick me out.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife was sitting in all those. So she saw what I was saying. She saw both sides of the arguments as they were unfolding. So while I wasn't
these weren't like judicial committees or something. These are
they were just coming
elders coming to your house, or
more like a shepherding visit type.
Yeah, like a shepherding call. Okay, I thought that was odd that.
And my wife's at home with. Okay. Yeah, and she's got little kids at home. So by this time, my daughter was born in 2014. So little kids at home. So she was around. She was hearing it. So while I wasn't overtly trying to share these things with her, I also wasn't hiding them, and she could hear what I was saying and what the elders were saying. And she's always been smarter. There's a level of, for me, I had to obsess over it and pull it apart and dissect it in every detail, whereas for her, she was able to cut through a lot of that and just get at the core stuff. If that's wrong, then we can just throw out the rest.
We all react to this differently. We
I
all
wish I had her
different ways and detach in different ways.
And I just think she has far more emotional intelligence around it.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was going in. It wasn't a strategic approach in my body at all. Like I was just going in. This is what I felt I had to do. And I just think her approach was more considered and probably more empathetic of people around her, which is good. I mean, I can learn from her. It's been nice. But so that was happening in the background. I'd say she was probably about 6 months to a year behind where my head was at with what's happening within the organisation. So, yeah, that was all happening. I was bringing up things that were making my father very uncomfortable. I would talk about things like the 2-witness rule, and because I was on the fringes of how all these things worked. I knew the elders book, and I said, that's a problem. That's an obvious thing that's going to lead to harm. And this is before the Australian Royal Commission came out. So when that came out, it wasn't surprising to me, but I couldn't get, by that stage, I was the black sheep, and nobody would listen to anything I said. And I thought, look, everything that I've been saying is a likely outgrowth of this doctrine is happening, and we've got evidence for it. and you can watch it live. You don't have to filter it through an apostate lens. This is just a court proceeding. Anyone can tune in at any time. And that fell on deaf ears by that stage. There was also an odd situation in that when I had moved back, this is going to jump around a bit, but as I was working with my father, I had moved into my grandmother's house, which is my mother's mother, to take care of her because her husband had passed away. They were quite old. She was in her 80s. So I renovated a granny flat under her house, and my wife and I were living underneath my grandmother's house, and we became full-time carers for her for about 5 years. And I think the dynamic of if I was deconstructing and bringing all these questions to elders in a different setting, I think they would have gone after me harder. But the fact that I was a full-time carer for my grandmother, who was very liked and respected within the organisation as well, I think it gave me a little bit more freedom to sort of push, whereas I think they would have just cut me off and had nothing to do with me much quicker. And it's also why I think possibly I managed to fade despite the fact that I went after the religion pretty aggressively. I don't think many people get that luxury. I sort of think you take your course and then you get shut down pretty quick. And in that sense, it's why I think I'd said shunned-ish at the start. I wasn't ever disfellowshipped, although I think if they really wanted to, they could. But the elders that I was speaking to, they were actually, one in particular, he very intelligent and a genuinely nice person. And I think he genuinely believed that he's got the answers. And his line was, well, if you're not actively involved with other witnesses and you're not trying to change anyone's mind, we're happy to leave you alone. And that's how I managed to fade. That being said, things had soured with my father so much that he started to see me as a very dangerous person within the religion and had started to push other family members to shun. And he had started shunning. He got me fired from where I was working, which was particularly difficult. He spoke to a lot of my wife's family to get them to shun her. It was a real shift. It got quite nasty there, and I think he was acting out of hurt. But once he realised I wasn't easily going to be reasoned back around, and I'd done my research, it shifted from a rescue mission to a you got to push me away. And it got quite nasty. He offered to financially support my wife and family if she would leave me. So
how's that feel?
I was saying before about those boundaries already being there shortly after Mum died. That didn't hit as hard as I thought it would because the relationship wasn't there anyway. It definitely backfired on that because my wife thought it was ridiculous. Like it's a horrible thing to say to try and break up your own son's marriage.
Well, yeah, and he's an elder, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I would assume that did not make her love the truth more.
Yeah, I think there's a separation between my father acting the way he did and the organisation at large. I don't think she saw them as one and the same. And I definitely sort of as things progressed after Mum had died, I realised that my father got a lot of people offside with his approach of being that direct and that level of self-righteous control. Mm-hmm. And it rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way. And sort of looking back on it now, I think there were actually plenty of witnesses that didn't particularly like the way he did things. And I think his reputation's taken a bit of a hit. I don't really know because I don't have any contact. But yeah, that didn't go as he would have hoped. But again, I actually think he was acting out of what he thought was the right thing to do. He thinks he's protecting the spirituality of his grandkids. It's just a really messed up way to do it. It's witness. It's being a witness.
Most
you
people
can be
do terrible
motivated by
things
good
think
things.
they're doing the right thing.
That's right. And
You know,
and I don't think it was necessarily a spiteful or malicious thing for him to be doing, because I understand his reasoning. But
do you offer that same understanding to yourself when you're thinking about how you behaved as you were learning the truth and about the truth and things like that? Are you able to extend that to yourself? Because
I don't think, absolutely. I know that my approach, there was no malice or spite in it. The only regret is probably at my own immaturity, which I think that's just part of getting more mature. Is if you didn't feel
being immature
like you were
growing up.
if you don't feel some sort of regret or feel that you could have handled things better in the past, you're probably not progressing from my perspective. That doesn't tie me up in knots too much. But
because you seem like a really compassionate dude. Like you seem like you have this great understanding for other people, and you deserve that same level of understanding because you were going through a tough time too, and trying to figure out what the right thing looked like in the face of something that was very wrong.
I appreciate the compliment. The compassionate side, it's something I'm actually working on. I wouldn't say that's actually one of my strengths. I think it's something I need to work on more. I can look back in hindsight, and I don't want to make the story make me sound like a hero in any way, because, like I was saying, time over, I would have handled it very differently. I hopefully working towards being more compassionate would be a good thing. I think it's a good ideal, but I wouldn't say that's one of my strengths. I would say
it's
probably
no one's strength. Very few people's strengths coming from a cult that tells you everything that you're doing wrong and then has you internalize that and be very hard on yourself. That's a difficult thing for a lot of people. And I just, you deserve that same. I mean, you are neither the hero nor the villain. You're just a person going through a thing and growing and, trying to figure it out, and figuring things out is messy, isn't it? For all of us.
Absolutely.
I'm just glad that you did, because it has allowed other people. Well, I guess I don't know where everything is in your situation right now, but hopefully it's allowed other people to maybe figure some things out too. It sounds like perhaps your wife has figured out some things, but hopefully it's it's been good for the people who are open and curious about life and down to grow as well. But for those who are stuck in their ways and they're not really ready to change and they're not very open, it's going to come off as an affront.
Yeah, and sort of where we're at, just getting towards the end of the story, I guess, is we've lost contact with all family on both sides. By and large, my wife's still got some contact, but we're viewing it as the family tree has been pruned back down to a stump, and we're the beginning again. So we're starting a scratch without our kids, without any of all that baggage. We're the new beginning point. It's challenging in its way, because that means there's absolutely no support networks there. Like, there's nobody to watch the kids. There's nobody. It's just us. And that's got its own challenges, but hopefully it's the start of a healthier family, generation to generation. That's how we're choosing to look at it anyway. But yeah, that's sort of where it's at now. I don't think there's any sense where I feel like there's going to be any reconciliation with the family. It's sort of a bit of a conflicting view I have when we talk about shunned and being the podcast, in that the shunning came from their direction first, but I also don't know that I would want them in my life anyway. Not that I would actively shun them, but I feel like they've got a lot of ground to make up before I feel like they're healthy people for myself or my kids to be around. So in a sense, I think the healthier choice is to cut them from my life, even if they would want to have something to do with me, which they don't. So it actually makes it easier. But I get the sense sometimes that people feel like they should always leave that door open to family. But I sort of think with everything that's happened, they've got to make up some ground. Like, it's not even meeting halfway. They've got to realize that they're, especially the higher up you are within the organization, the more you're accountable for, the more harm I personally feel that you're aware of and that you've ignored. I know directly that one of my uncles is mentioned by name in the Australian World Commission for one of the child abuse cases. I know that they know the extent of the problem within the organisation. And I know that they know I know. And I'm not comfortable having people that ignore that stuff in my life just because we share blood. And it feels like a bit of a hard line to draw, but it also feels justified. And that's sort of something I'm not quite sure where my head's at. But that's why I think it's easier just to feel like a clean break and a fresh start with my wife and my kids. And I'll let them deal with their own consciences about what they're ignoring. And who knows, maybe decades down the line, they'll unpack all this stuff for themselves. But yeah, I just don't feel any obligation.
Yes, you are killing it right now. If I could, I want to start the standing ovation for everyone listening, because you said so much there. You're right. You know, Jehovah's Witnesses say that shunning is a protection for the congregation, right?
Absolutely.
In the end, actually shunning can be a protection for us. I'm not saying it doesn't hurt. I'm not saying it's not a messed up thing to do to another person, but it does keep toxic people away from us. People who are not healthy, people who put up with or condone, they're still giving their allegiance to an organization that is hurting people on the daily. And, you know, some of them know, some of them don't, whatever the case may be. But yes, these people aren't typically the healthiest people. And when you start setting healthy boundaries, like maybe keeping unhealthy people at least arm's length and away from your kids, and protecting your kids as necessary. When you start setting healthy boundaries and you come from a cult environment where you were never taught to set boundaries, even saying the word, no, I won't allow you to be unhealthy around my kid, like those healthy boundaries feel like you're being mean. You're not being mean. You've just never set a boundary before. And you don't know, it feels mean because it's new and it's not something you were ever allowed to do, to say no to unhealthy people. You had to accept them and love them and to, you know, have them around all the time. You don't have to do that anymore. And you just said that in a very eloquent way, in the way that it is conflicting. It does feel weird on some level, but yeah, I wouldn't want to hang out with my Jehovah's Witness family either. I know who they are, and they've got a lot of growing to do to be healthy enough people to really have safe relationships with for me as an adult, or for my, if I had kids, for them, certainly, right? So good for you for making that decision and loving on your little stump there of a family tree and growing it out to be something beautiful, stopping those patterns. That's awesome, Daniel. I hope you
I
feel
think
really proud of that. That's
it's
hard to do.
it was a shift, just a shift in the framing of it. When you're kicked out and they're actively shunning you, they want you to feel like the beaten dog. They want you to feel like you're in the wrong. You've done something wrong.
Yep.
I see that they're doing that. Like, I know for a fact I haven't done anything wrong because I know what my motives and intentions were. I know for a fact they've done and are doing a lot wrong. So if anyone should feel sheepish or shy about or wanting to earn a relationship, the role needs to be flipped there. And again, that just comes down to the critical thinking side of it. There's the emotional framework that they try and use to make you feel bad, but the facts of the matter are the people harming other people are the ones in the wrong. It's a very simple calculus, and they should own the guilt. They should own the discomfort. They should do the work at improving themselves to be back in other people's lives. And it sounds obvious, but coming to the realization, it was kind of a relief. And that's not to take away from the fact that it's still traumatic as hell and it's still difficult and it's been a rough road, and I still think I've got a lot of learning to do. But yeah, that's sort of where we're at now, and we're out. My wife and I and our children were out doing our own thing. We've moved out of Sydney, and we're just starting from scratch again.
Well, again, I think you said all of that beautifully, and yes, you're putting the responsibility back where it belongs. You're taking the like. There's no reason for you to feel like a bad person. You haven't done anything wrong here. That, like you said, they're the ones who bear that responsibility. Shunning is an act that you do to another person. You know, I haven't shunned anybody. I got shunned. My door is still open. My phone number is the same. My email, my Facebook is public. Come say hi. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can reach out if you wanted, but you're not going to, and that's your choice, and that's fine. But even if you did, yeah, unless you've left Jehovah's Witnesses, unless you've left that toxicity behind, I don't think that we can really have much. What will we talk about? I don't think there'd be a lot to talk about. So it's just a shame. But for yourself, you're moving on. But at the same time, is there anything, if you had an opportunity to say anything to the people who shun you guys, is there anything you would say?
I've been thinking about that. I honestly don't know that there is. It just, when I look back on my own path out, I think I've covered so much ground, and they would have to cover that same ground. They would have to realize how hurtful they've been to other people while they've been in the cult. I had to realize that, and it's just part of you that you have to own, that even if you were motivated by good intentions, you've acted in ways because of the way you were raised and molded that hurt other people. You've got to internalize all that stuff. You've got to feel sorry for it and hope to work. There's so much ground that they would have to cover before I feel like there would be any meaningful conversation to be had. I don't really have any message for them other than hopefully you tread that path. That's it.
I love that response, because you're saying, I don't really need to say anything to them. They're the ones who need to have something to say to me. They're the ones that need to make the approach, and they have to own some things before we can really have any kind of conversation.
Absolutely. And that's not to say that I didn't have my own things to own, and I definitely do. But we're,
We all do.
until we're all on that same page, I just don't see conversation as meaningful or productive in any way. So it sounds harsh when I say it, but that's sort of just where my head's at.
Well, no, I get it. I remember I reached out to my brother who I had shunned, and the outreach, as far as I remember, it's been a long time now, but I started off with an apology uh, because I had some stuff to own. I had realized some things and needed to make sure that I owned that, whether or not he ever wanted to speak to me again. That would be on him. But I needed to make my apologies anyway because I messed up.
Yeah.
I was doing what I was programmed to do. There are reasons that I did those things, but I have to own the fact that I did those things, and I'm sorry. I didn't
Yeah.
realize I was emotionally blackmailing someone basically, or extorting them for a relationship by shunning them. And yeah, I think that a lot of us need to hear that from certain relatives for us to ever have any kind of conversations.
Yeah, totally agree.
Ownership.
That's it. Yeah.
So, I don't know, are there any things that you've learned since leaving? So is there any resources that you found particularly helpful? Anything that you've learned since you've been out that, just been striking to you?
Resources. It's difficult to narrow it down to one. I think the most formative thing I ever learned was critical thinking, which was something that I just lucked onto early on with a Google search. And just as a filter, it's like I'm interested in, I've been picking apart things like cult psychology. I'm curious to know exactly how they mess with my head. And the process of finding where the cult indoctrination stops and where your personality begins and who you would have been, and that whole process. But I always fall back on critical thinking because it's just that filter through which you can prevent yourself from being lied to again. And it's something I think I'm probably a bit hypersensitive towards, but it works. It's a good general tool, I think. So resources for that, I found Carl Sagan's book Demon Haunted World was really compelling for me.
What was it called?
Demon Haunted World, which will probably scare off any witnesses from reading it.
Okay.
Yeah, and everything was sort of an add-on to that because it built the toolbox of reason through which then I could assess every other claim I was going to look at. And it also justified why it was presenting those ideas, which was nice. So that was probably the big thing. Resources, I don't think I'm in a position to tell other people how to successfully get out yet because I'm still in the beginning of building my life on the outside. But it's an ongoing process to me. So I don't want to say...
Yeah, I was just looking for resources. If there were things that had helped you in your waking process, or like you said there, that book around critical thinking. I know you mentioned some university classes and such. I don't know if maybe you had anything there that you wanted to share that, a specific book, which you did. And that's great. Well, that's a place to start.
I mean, I can nerd out on it. I've got so many, like audiobooks saved my life because I was able to work surrounded by witnesses and be taking in information that was useful to me the whole time, and I was a bit of a sponge for it. So a lot of the great courses, I got a membership to that. And then any topic you want to learn about, the biology course was huge. It was about 80 hours long and fairly dense. But I mean, it's whatever your curiosity is there for that's been shut down for so long. I loved having the great courses as just so much dense information. I went down the rabbit hole of exjw online community. I still find some of it quite interesting. Not so much because I've already pulled all that stuff apart for myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't feel like I need to go over it again. I like in this forum hearing stories. I find it more interesting from the psychological point of view. Steve Hassan's book on combating cult mind control, which I know lots of witnesses refer to, that was pretty eye-opening. Yeah, they're probably my main recommendations.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So what then do you enjoy about your new life, your new little family tree there? What do you enjoy about living the life that you have today? And is there anything that you're hoping to, anywhere you're hoping to take it?
That's an ongoing process. I'm still in the process of sorting that out and giving it a bit more direction. At the moment, we're just sort of coming through COVID with 2 young kids, moving house. We're sort of, it still feels at a very preliminary mode.
So maybe you're not sure as far as where you want to go specifically from here, but is there at least anything, what do you enjoy just about life today? What do you enjoy about life?
We've moved to a particularly nice part of the world up in Newcastle, which is north of Sydney, and it's nice just being near the beach. It's something my wife and I both always liked, and we're near some beautiful beaches, and that's nice for the kids. It sounds kind of cliche, but it's just a very simple thing about just enjoying what's in front of us. And just being aware of what we have got here and just continually working at improving, hopefully, building a new direction for our own kids that we never had. That's what we look forward to. And it's also nice to not have anyone looking over your shoulder to tell you how it should or shouldn't be done, but just to back your own steps and see how it works out.
Absolutely. Happiness is a very present quality. It's just being happy at the smell of coffee first thing in the morning, or it's being happiness at the warmth of the touch of your partner, or it's taking your kids outside or going to the beach or enjoying the clouds in the sky or whatever the case may be. Happiness doesn't have to be some major goal or singular purpose that you're executing your life toward. It's just enjoying the everyday things. And I'm glad that you guys are able to do that now as your own people and making your own choices and figuring out what it is that you all like, and that and then helping your kids to figure that out for themselves, be their own people.
Yep, that's the plan. We'll see how it goes.
All right, Daniel. Well, I appreciate you telling your story today.
Oh, thank you.